She didn't just file complaints. She declared war on her own neighbor. From trash cans to mailbox colors to lawn height, she reported everything, and when he still didn't break, she tried to take his house. The HOA backed her, the board threatened him, and the fines kept coming. But what none of them knew was that their authority had expired years ago, and he had the proof. This time, the Karen picked the wrong homeowner. When he first arrived in the neighborhood, the world beyond his front door looked peaceful, predictable, and well-maintained. The lawns were evenly trimmed, the mailboxes stood in uniform rows, and the houses appeared carefully coordinated in appearance and tone. To most people, it would have seemed like the ideal place to begin a quieter chapter of life. For him, it felt like a well-earned reward. After years of working long hours and saving carefully, he had finally purchased a home in a community that promised order, safety, and long-term stability. The Homeowners Association, according to the paperwork, ensured community standards would be upheld and property values would be kept strong. That sounded reasonable. During the first few days, he unpacked gradually, placing furniture inside, storing tools in the garage, and arranging boxes in neat stacks. Neighbors watched from a distance, some offering polite nods, though no one stopped by to welcome him. He didn't mind. He preferred a quiet start to things. The home itself was modest but suited to him. A sturdy yard, a driveway large enough for his truck, and enough space out back to eventually plant a garden. The HOA rules, which arrived in a thick binder, seemed strict but manageable. He glanced through some sections and noted the common guidelines: no unapproved exterior paint colors, restrictions on fence height, and limits on where trash bins could be placed. There was no immediate concern. In those early days, he paid attention to the weekends. That was usually when neighborhoods revealed their personality. A few families barbecued while music played in the background, and children rode bikes in predictable circles. Everything looked coordinated, nearly curated. Yet there was a subtle tension that hovered like humidity. Neighbors whispered to one another before glancing across the street. And a small group often stood together as if silently judging the movement of cars and people. He soon learned about the board members, though not directly. Snippets of conversation drifted across lawns, mentions of quarterly meetings, references to the bylaws, gossip about fines issued to homeowners for seemingly insignificant things. There was one name that surfaced more than any other, someone the residents referred to in tones that mixed irritation with deference. She was a senior board member, a figure of authority with an obsession for compliance, and someone who believed the neighborhood's reputation depended on absolute control. Though they rarely used her actual first name, one word attached itself naturally to her: Karen. He noticed her on his fourth day. She walked slowly down the street holding a clipboard, pausing at driveways and fences as if conducting an inspection. Her eyes scanned details: grass height, mailbox condition, parking alignment. When her gaze landed on his property, she paused a little too long. Her expression was unreadable, a blend of interest and disapproval that left no comfort in its wake. Without a word, she made a note on her clipboard and moved on. He assumed she was simply cataloging something for the HOA records. There was no confrontation, and he continued settling in. Over the next week, he trimmed his shrubs, swept the driveway, and placed his trash bins neatly by the side of the house. Everything seemed in line with the rules he skimmed. On the seventh day, an envelope appeared, taped to his front door. It was from the Homeowners Association and labeled as a courtesy notice. According to the letter, his trash bin had been visible from the street for part of the day, which constituted a violation. He recalled leaving it out for only an hour before rolling it back behind the fence. The letter included no fine yet, just a formal reminder. He shrugged it off, believing it must be a misunderstanding, but misunderstandings repeated quickly. Only 2 days later, another notice arrived, this time citing the length of his grass by some measured standard. He had mowed just last weekend, and the lawn was shorter than several others on the street. Again, the notice carried no fine, just a warning tone about non-compliance expectations. The pattern gained momentum. A third notice appeared regarding the color of his mailbox post, which was the color it had been when he purchased the home. A fourth notice addressed the placement of his vehicle tires slightly beyond the driveway edge. Each letter was increasingly stern. Though no fines were attached yet, the implications were clear. Something was being built case by case. He decided to attend the next HOA meeting, simply to observe. It was held at the small clubhouse near the entrance to the neighborhood. The room had a sterile atmosphere with folding chairs, a long table up front, and a projector screen displaying the association's logo. Board members sat at the table, each with stacks of documents and identical stern expressions. Karen was seated in the center, posture rigid, her pen resting atop a fresh notepad. Residents trickled in, many exchanging hushed greetings. He took a seat near the back, careful not to draw attention. As the meeting commenced, the board immediately dived into a list of resident infractions. Names, addresses, and violations were read aloud in monotone, followed by brief remarks from Karen about repeat offenses. Most homeowners stayed silent, accepting the reprimands with lowered eyes. He waited for general updates or positive announcements, but the agenda focused almost entirely on enforcement and discipline. At no point did they discuss community projects, maintenance improvements, or neighborly collaboration. The board's power was not just procedural, it was dominant, and the homeowners appeared accustomed to living under it. After the meeting, he quietly stepped outside. Some residents gathered in small circles, speaking in nervous undertones about fines and past conflicts. He overheard mentions of lawsuits, foreclosure threats, and personal grudges disguised as bylaw enforcement. It became clear that fear, not cooperation, kept this neighborhood orderly. That evening, he reread the binder of rules. He paid attention to detail this time, flipping through sections with highlighted paragraphs and amendments attached to the back. There were references to board elections, voting processes, enforcement procedures, and homeowner rights. Certain clauses sounded vague or outdated, though he lacked the context to interpret them yet. Still, he sensed there was more to the HOA than just appearances. In the days that followed, Karen's presence intensified. She walked past his home frequently, always scanning, always noting. He made sure his property stayed within the rules, or at least within what any reasonable person would interpret as compliance. Yet the notices continued. Each envelope felt like an omen. What had started as a mild annoyance was gradually evolving into something far more deliberate. He watched other residents quietly suffer. Some whispered their frustrations near their driveways, careful not to be overheard. Others accepted fines like rent they couldn't avoid. Yet everyone appeared resigned, unwilling, or unable to resist. The board didn't just enforce rules, it thrived on submission. The turning point came with the fifth notice. This time, the letter did more than warn. It listed cumulative observations and stated that if changes were not made, fines would begin immediately. The language was harsh, and the letter was signed directly by Karen's name. She was no longer hiding behind general HOA correspondence. She was leading the crusade. Unsettled but not defeated, he placed the letter in a folder with the previous four. He began documenting everything. Dates, photos, actions taken, and inconsistencies he noticed in how other homes were treated. Each new envelope only reinforced his determination to understand the invisible forces shaping this community. The peaceful impression he once cherished had evaporated. The neighborhood's facade remained pristine, but beneath it, control and intimidation thrived. He realized he was no longer just a new homeowner adjusting to an unfamiliar environment. He had become a target. And whether he wanted conflict or not, it had already found him. The morning light filtered gently across the rooftops, casting long shadows that stretched across driveways and trimmed lawns. He had grown accustomed to the quiet of early hours, when the neighborhood had not yet stepped into its daily posture of caution and observation. Most homes remained closed to the world, blinds drawn and dog walkers keeping to the edges of the sidewalks. But quiet didn't mean peace in this place, only a momentary pause between tensions. The latest notice still sat on his kitchen counter, its language sharp and formal. The accusation within was trivial, yet the tone carried an unmistakable warning. Non-compliance would no longer be tolerated. He had already begun to suspect that the so-called courtesy warnings were nothing more than a structured prelude to a much deeper escalation. Every envelope felt like another brick laid in a wall being built around him, and he could tell that Karen, clipboard in hand, had no intention of stopping. Within days, yet another envelope arrived. This one addressed the placement and size of a decorative planter he kept near his front steps. The letter claimed it exceeded the dimensions allowed by the guidelines, though no specific rule was cited. He measured it twice. Its size was entirely ordinary, indistinguishable from similar planters throughout the neighborhood. He noted that fact carefully in his growing file, along with a time-stamped photo. Soon after, a different warning referenced his choice of exterior lighting. The letter claimed that a porch light he had turned on briefly at night cast illumination beyond approved wattage. The pettiness of the statement reinforced something he had already begun to conclude. This was not about property standards. It was targeted, deliberate, and personal. He walked the neighborhood quietly that week, not to complain, but to watch. What he saw confirmed everything he suspected. Several homes displayed identical or larger decor than his own. A truck parked partially on the grass in front of another property drew no notice. A folded basketball hoop stood at the edge of another driveway. Trash bins of distant homes were left exposed for most of the day without any reprimands. Each observation joined the folder of evidence, building a silent case he was not yet ready to reveal. Residents noticed his presence during these quiet walks. Some cast quick glances before turning away, unwilling to engage. Others lingered in resigned silence, their faces lined with the expression of people who had long ago accepted defeat. He could sense they recognized what was happening to him, but their fear of becoming targets kept them distant. As the harassment continued, he began studying the HOA bylaws in earnest each night. The thick binder he once ignored became a critical resource. Page by page, he discovered language that was startlingly rigid in some places, yet vague in others. Revisions from years past were attached as loose sheets, some with conflicting instructions or ambiguous phrasing. The organizational structure of the board, once assumed to be clearly outlined, now appeared tangled and dated. He learned something valuable. Most of the authority the board wielded depended on member compliance and uninformed consent. Enforcement procedures relied on standardized warning structures, official votes, and documented meetings, all of which required proper record-keeping and fair application. He suspected that behind the veneer of strictness lay a network of shortcuts, overlooked requirements, and possibly unauthorized decisions. Karen's patrols increased with unsettling precision. She appeared at odd intervals, walking slowly past his home, glancing at his driveway, peering briefly into the side yard, and jotting notes with exaggerated purpose. She never spoke to him, but her presence communicated everything she needed it to. Each time she behaved as if she were cataloging infractions that already existed in her mind. Another notice appeared within days. This one accused him of allowing excessive foliage to grow near his back fence. He had no such growth, only a few shrubs that he had trimmed recently. He documented the condition of the fence line with photographs and a date-stamped note. Still, the warnings accumulated in his file as if building toward an inevitable result. Neighbors had begun to whisper with more urgency. A man across the street watched from behind a curtain each time Karen made her rounds. A couple of houses down, they exchanged concerned looks when he walked by, but they remained silent, perhaps wary of drawing attention. He began to understand that Karen's influence was not only backed by HOA power, it was reinforced by fear. Many had faced similar treatment before him and had found resistance too costly. The first official fine arrived before the month ended. An envelope printed with the HOA's seal declared him in violation of multiple property appearance standards. The language was broad, referencing previous notices and citing them collectively in a single paragraph. A fee was assigned without a breakdown of charges, and a deadline for payment was printed at the bottom. Non-payment would trigger further fines and potential legal action. He placed the notice gently in his folder, alongside the warnings and photographs. His reaction was calm, almost detached. He had anticipated this outcome and now saw its arrival as confirmation rather than surprise. Karen and the board had moved to the next stage of pressure. A second fine followed, this time linked to unauthorized exterior maintenance changes. The accusation referenced his porch planter again and claimed the item had not been approved by the architectural committee. He searched the bylaws for any mention of such requirements and found the language ambiguous enough for them to twist. Still, the enforcement method seemed inconsistent with official procedure. What unsettled him most was that the board's tactics extended beyond letters. He noticed unfamiliar vehicles idling slowly past his home during daylight hours. On one occasion, a board member he recognized from the meeting stood across the street, pretending to check their phone while peering repeatedly at his property. He recorded the sightings with dates and descriptions. The situation escalated further when he received a certified letter from the HOA. The envelope carried a tone distinctly different from the previous ones. Inside, a formal violation summary listed alleged offenses in chronological order, each with increasing severity. At the end of the document, a note warned that continued non-compliance could result in a lien being placed on his home. The language edged closer to aggression, threatening the one thing most people were too afraid to risk. He knew now that the harassment was designed to provoke submission, resignation, or departure. Many before him had likely caved long before reaching this point. But instead of retreating, he felt a quiet resolve settling in. The intimidation that would shake most homeowners had instead sharpened his focus. Behind the scenes, he began to prepare in earnest. He compiled every notice, scanned each document, and organized his photographs in dated folders. He returned to the bylaws with renewed scrutiny, seeking structural weaknesses in the rules themselves. He highlighted passages referencing board elections, special committees, compliance recordings, and member rights. He noticed missing signatures on some revisions. He found amendments without proper ratification notes. He also began recording the dates of board meetings and searching for attendance lists. He looked for inconsistencies in procedures Karen claimed to enforce. He started to sense that the authority being used against him was not as solid as it appeared, and that Karen might be overstepping in ways she assumed no one would detect. Each envelope delivered to his door no longer represented intimidation. It was evidence, fuel for something larger he had not yet revealed. And as the HOA accelerated its pursuit, he remained outwardly silent, giving them the illusion of compliance while quietly building the foundation for a response they would not expect. In the eyes of the board, he appeared cornered. In his own mind, the shaping of his counterattack had only just begun. The silence inside his home had become a kind of war room stillness, papers stacked in neat piles, folders labeled and sorted, photographs filed with careful timestamps. Nothing in his preparation was rushed or reactionary. Each document, each notice, each policy excerpt formed a piece of a larger structure he was quietly assembling. But even with his growing collection of evidence, the HOA continued its advance with the confidence of an entity that had never been effectively challenged. The certified letter that arrived next did not bother with pretenses of courtesy. The envelope bore the association's seal, and the tone of the contents spoke with legal certainty. The notice declared him in ongoing violation of community standards and listed the accumulated fines along with a deadline for payment. The final paragraph conveyed the sharpest threat yet. Failure to comply would result in the initiation of lien proceedings against his home, with foreclosure as a possible consequence. The words were designed for intimidation. The intent was to shock the reader into either compliance or retreat, but instead of panic, a cold clarity settled over him. The threat confirmed that Karen and the board intended to push him not just into submission, but potentially out of the neighborhood entirely. Foreclosure to them was not a theoretical measure. It was leverage. He sat down at his kitchen table and read the letter again slowly. Nowhere in the notice was there any reference to the right to dispute charges, request evidence, or attend a hearing. No itemized breakdown of fines accompanied the demand. All of it spoke of authority, yet none of it reflected due process. He placed the letter with the others in his growing archive. In most homes targeted like this, there would have been fear. Fear of legal costs, fear of credit damage, fear of losing the very property people worked their lives to obtain. That fear was what kept the board powerful. But fear was not the emotion driving him now. Strategy was. 2 days after the foreclosure threat, an HOA representative knocked on his door. He didn't open it, but he watched from the window as a middle-aged man in business attire left another envelope at the doorstep. When the visitor walked away, he retrieved it without hesitation. This time, the message came stamped with the name of a law firm the board sometimes used for escalated enforcement. Inside, the document referenced failure to meet corrective directives and warned of legal intervention. It was another attempt to corner him into surrender. That evening, he took a walk through the neighborhood again, not out of frustration, but observation. The street lines were as orderly as ever, but the tension underneath had thickened. The residents who once cast sidelong glances now avoided eye contact entirely, as if acknowledging him would place a target on their backs. Several windows held curtains slightly parted, watching him with a mixture of concern and caution. At one corner of the home, a woman stood behind her screen door for several seconds before stepping away quickly. She looked like someone holding back words she could not afford to say. Across the street, a man tending his lawn made brief eye contact before lowering his gaze and adjusting his sprinkler with forced focus. The quiet resistance of the neighborhood, their silence, was as much a symptom of the HOA's power as the notices themselves. That night, he returned to the bylaws again, but this time with a different intent. He no longer read them as a set of restrictive rules, but as a written structure that, if flawed, could be dismantled. Most homeowners accepted enforcement without question. He refused to do the same. He focused on sections addressing due process, board elections, amendment procedures, architectural requests, notice policies, and voting quorums. He found passages that contradicted others. Outdated revisions were scattered among newer insertions with no signatures or timestamps. Some appendices referenced committees that no longer existed. A turning point came when he discovered a clause buried in an older amendment referencing the board's enforcement authority. According to that document, any fines or lien threats required a documented vote by the full board, recorded minutes, and verified homeowner notification with the option to contest. Yet none of the notices he received referenced a vote or provided evidence of one. The board, led by Karen, had likely bypassed their own protocol, either out of arrogance or long-standing habit. He printed the clause and placed it in a separate folder labeled Procedural Violations. The foreclosure warning, now lacking procedural backing, became less of a threat and more of a liability for them. But he wasn't finished. He began cross-referencing board member terms. The bylaws stated that leadership roles required re-election after a specific number of years. Yet no record of recent elections appeared in the documents made available to residents. Meeting minutes were sparse and selectively edited. Agendas were posted late or not at all. He suspected that the board, and Karen in particular, had been operating with authority not properly renewed or approved. If verified, this would undermine the legitimacy of many of their actions, including their threats against him. Meanwhile, new letters continued arriving. Each one was more aggressive than the last, each designed to pressure him into paying fines or making changes he didn't owe them. They claimed his driveway was improperly maintained, even though no visible issue existed. They cited landscape nonconformity, though the property met every reasonable standard. It was a campaign of attrition, focused on creating exhaustion rather than justice. The residents, though silent, were not blind. He could feel their awareness growing. Some began watching from further away. A few lingered longer before stepping inside their homes. The fear they carried had been shaped through repeated examples. People fined into compliance, people embarrassed in meetings, people who sold their homes quietly after extended battles. Karen's influence was not just administrative, it was psychological. Still, patterns of abuse always leave evidence. And the HOA, confident in its routine, had not considered that someone might one day collect every inconsistency, every misstep, every procedural flaw, and turn it back on them. The next escalation came not as paper but as scheduling. Another notice informed him of a mandatory compliance review to be held in 2 weeks. The letter implied that failure to attend could result in immediate legal referral. The tone was absolute, the deadline immediate. He did not respond. Instead, he made 3 copies of every notice, every photograph, every highlighted section of the bylaws, and every documented discrepancy. He divided them into labeled packets and placed them in secure folders. One packet stayed with him. Another went into a safe deposit box in a bank downtown. The third was set aside for future use. Karen and the board believed they were tightening a noose. From their vantage point, he was a homeowner cornered by the inevitability of their system. But they could not see the truth forming behind the carefully calm exterior. Every threat they issued, every false violation they assigned, every protocol they ignored was not closing in around him, it was circling back toward them. As the deadline for payment approached, the HOA prepared to push harder. The board was ready to send final notices. Karen walked the neighborhood with a lifted chin and sharpened certainty. She believed the house she targeted would either bend or break. What she didn't know was that she had already crossed the boundary between authority and vulnerability. Each step she took closer to forcing him out had brought her closer to exposing everything she and her board had done wrong. The threat was not his to fear anymore. It had become theirs to face. The days leading to the so-called compliance review passed with a deceptive quiet. Notices had not stopped, but their tone no longer carried the same weight in his mind. What once felt like an oncoming storm now resembled the last surge of a weakening tide. Karen and the board still believed they held control, unaware that their authority had already begun to fracture beneath them. He spent his evenings sorting through the growing archive of evidence. Photographs, certified letters, copies of fines, and excerpts from the bylaws. Every violation notice had been cataloged, every inconsistency recorded. What had begun as a defense had evolved into something far more strategic. The more he studied, the more he uncovered. And the more he uncovered, the more obvious the flaws became. But amidst the tangle of outdated amendments and contradictory clauses, one discovery stood out. It came late one night, when he was cross-referencing enforcement procedures with board responsibilities. He had already highlighted sections that addressed member rights, appeal processes, and committee approvals. But a small, rarely cited section in the back pages caught his attention. Not because of what it said, but because of what it required. It was a clause referencing board validity. The bylaw stated, in clear language, that the HOA board's legal authority to enforce fines, impose liens, and represent the association depended on one essential condition. The board must be properly elected by the community at intervals no longer than a set number of years. Not appointed, not extended, not assumed into continuation. Elected, verified, recorded. He turned the page to the revision notes. The amendment reaffirming this clause had been added years prior, and a handwritten notation referenced an upcoming election at that time. Yet, digging through publicly available minutes and records posted on the HOA's limited access website, he found no evidence of any recent board elections. The last documented one occurred long before many current residents even moved in. The implication was seismic. If the board had not held valid elections within the required period, then their status as decision-makers had technically expired. Their authority to issue fines, approve enforcement actions, escalate legal threats, or pursue foreclosure would be null. Every warning, every notice, every demand they sent him, and perhaps dozens of other homeowners, had been issued by a body operating without proper legal standing. He printed the clause, circled the date of the last recorded election, and annotated the relevant passages. The discovery didn't simply weaken their case, it threatened to erase it. But that wasn't the only flaw. While exploring the section concerning architectural approval procedures, he found another buried requirement that the board had consistently ignored. Any complaint or violation concerning property appearance had to originate through a standardized submission process. That process included photographic documentation, a verification signature from at least 2 board members, and a notification of the right to dispute. Not one of the letters he received adhered to that standard. Every warning had come unilaterally, bearing Karen's name or the HOA's printed header, with no mention of board votes or procedural documentation. He placed that clause into a second folder. It labeled the enforcement methods themselves as invalid. The deeper he went, the more cracks emerged. Many amendments lacked the signatures required for ratification. Some revisions referenced committees that no longer existed. Certain enforcement powers had been updated in later documents, but were never officially adopted by the membership. It became clear the board had accumulated authority through precedent, not process, an unchallenged tradition upheld by fear and silence. By the time the day of the compliance review letter arrived, he was ready. He didn't attend. When the appointed hour passed and he did not appear, the board likely saw it as defiance. They moved forward as planned, issuing an additional notice the next day that claimed his absence constituted non-cooperation and opened the door to further action under governing policy. That letter, too, was added to the growing record. He imagined the meeting that preceded it. A handful of board members gathered at the clubhouse, Karen at the center, reciting accusations with the confidence of someone who assumed the rules bent to her will. They would discuss fines, deadlines, and deadlines again. They would speak of consequences and legal pursuit. They would assure themselves that resistance always breaks eventually. They had no idea what was coming. Instead of reacting, he prepared. He drafted a concise but precise summary of bylaw violations committed by the board. He included references to every procedural flaw he uncovered: lack of elections, absence of voting records, invalid enforcement notices, failure to provide dispute options, and unauthorized fines. He formatted each point with citations drawn directly from the governing documents. Then he assembled his evidence into packets. Each packet contained copies of all violation, letters, photographs disproving the accusations, excerpts of bylaws with key sections, highlighted documentation of missing elections, notes on improper board, conduct records of harassment patterns, a timeline of events. One packet he set aside for the county records office. Another he prepared for legal counsel. A third would go directly to the homeowners themselves, printed, bound, and distributed when the time came. Karen continued her patrols without knowing any of this. She paused outside his home more frequently now, peering over hedges as though her gaze alone could uncover something punishable. The confidence in her posture had not faded. To her, silence equaled victory. The residents remained quiet too, but their eyes followed movement with curious uncertainty. Rumors had started, though no one spoke openly. Some wondered why he had not folded like others before him. Others sensed something unfolding beneath the surface, though they did not yet understand what. Late one afternoon, he stood in his backyard and looked beyond his fence at the surrounding homes. The symmetry of the neighborhood seemed more artificial than ever, rows of enforced compliance hiding an undercurrent of suppressed frustration. He wondered how many of these houses had endured the same pattern: targeted notices, compounding fines, veiled threats, and quiet resignation. He thought of the board's arrogance, their belief in unchecked continuity, their ignorance of their own bylaws, their assumption that authority could exist without accountability. They had built their power on fear and neglect, never expecting anyone to scrutinize the structure holding them up. Soon, he wouldn't need assumptions or speculation. He would have something stronger: exposure. He wasn't preparing for a hearing. He was preparing for a reckoning. By the time the HOA escalated again, as they surely would, his groundwork would be complete. The foreclosure threats, the fines, and the baseless accusations would no longer be weapons against him. They would become the evidence against those who sent them. Karen believed she was nearing her goal of forcing him into submission or out of his home altogether. She was, in reality, walking toward the moment her authority would collapse in front of everyone she had ruled over for years. The final turning point did not come with warning, sirens, or confrontation at the doorstep. It arrived through a letter, one more envelope bearing the HOA's insignia, one more attempt at intimidation cloaked in formal language. This notice declared the board's unanimous decision to move forward with legal action and initiate the process that could ultimately lead to foreclosure. They believed this would be the final blow, the notice that would break him where threats had failed. They didn't know it was the moment he had been waiting for. He let the letter rest beside the stack of documents he had prepared. The packet for legal counsel was already updated. The evidence for county authorities was labeled and sealed. But the most important set of documents, the one meant for the residents themselves, remained in a box near his desk, waiting for the day he would place it directly into their hands. That day was approaching faster than the board could have imagined. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning. Unlike closed-door reviews and committee sessions held under the pretense of authority, this meeting was open to all residents, as required by the same bylaws the board had ignored. They expected another empty room, another quiet gathering where policy could be dictated with no one to contest it. But this time would be different. In the days leading up to the meeting, he finalized every piece of evidence. His notes were organized with precision, and his citations were exact. The board operated with assumptions. He would operate with proof. He wasn't coming to ask for leniency. He was coming to dismantle the structure they believed made them untouchable. That morning, he arrived early at the community clubhouse. It was a plain building, beige walls, metal chairs, a long folding table where the board typically sat. Karen was already there, clipboard in hand, arranging papers with the self-importance of someone rehearsing authority. She looked up when he entered, and the flicker of irritation in her eyes betrayed that she had hoped he would stay away. Other board members filtered in behind her, faces shielded by formality, roles assumed by habit rather than legitimacy. They spoke in low tones, glancing at him with a mix of anticipation and annoyance. He took a seat, silent and composed, folder in hand. Then the residents began to arrive. At first, it was only a few neighbors curious about the growing tension they had quietly observed. Then more came. Some carried their own letters and fines. Others carried only questions. The room filled slowly but steadily, and as the crowd grew, the board's expressions shifted. The meeting they had expected to control was now different. The silent compliance they counted on was gone. Karen opened the session with rehearsed confidence. She spoke of ongoing violations, non-cooperative residents, and required enforcement actions. She referenced policy, authority, and responsibility. Her words floated across the room with the certainty of someone who expected no challenge. When she attempted to move on, he stood. The shift in the room was immediate. Conversations died out. Heads turned. The board members stiffened. Karen paused mid-sentence, startled by the interruption. He spoke with measured calm. Without raising his voice, he stated his intention to address not only the accusations against him, but the legitimacy of those making them. He laid the first packet of documents on the table in front of the board. Karen tried to interrupt, but he continued, refusing to yield the floor. He began with the elections. He cited the clause requiring regular, recorded, and member-verified board elections. He named the year of the last documented vote, read aloud the duration limits written in the bylaws, and pointed out the complete absence of any election records since. Among the residents, murmurs rose, some surprised, others unsurprised, but newly emboldened. He explained with textual proof that without valid elections, the current board's authority had lapsed. Every fine, notice, and action taken under their assumed power lacked legal standing. He then moved to enforcement procedures. He read aloud the requirements for properly filed complaints, photographic evidence, dual signatures, board votes, and notification of dispute rights. He held up every warning he had received, each lacking the mandated structure. The board members shifted in their seats. Karen's silence grew taut. Next came the fines. He listed every notice issued to him, followed by notes demonstrating the absence of appeals, the absence of documentation of board votes, and improper escalation threats. He explained how foreclosure threats were baseless without valid authority or due process. Then he expanded the scope. He invited any resident who had ever received a notice, fine, or threat to examine copies of the bylaws he had highlighted. People leaned in, scanning the documents in disbelief. Some recognized the patterns in their own experiences: unanswered disputes, fees with no explanation, unvoted amendments presented as policy. He presented the financial inconsistencies next: missing records, unexplained fees, and outdated amendments. But rather than accuse, he simply showed the gaps, letting silence reveal what the board had concealed through assumption and routine. Karen finally tried to regain control. She attempted to speak over him to reassert order, but her voice, once sharp with confidence, cracked under the weight of the room's attention. When she declared the meeting out of order, he responded by pointing to the section of the bylaws that protected residents' right to address the board and raise procedural violations. She fell quiet. He concluded not with outrage, but with clarity. He stated that unless the board could produce verified election records, ratified enforcement documentation, and procedurally valid notices, they lacked the authority they claimed. He recommended immediate suspension of all fines, a halting of foreclosure proceedings, and the scheduling of legitimate board elections. The silence that followed was not empty. It was decisive. Residents looked at one another with recognition. Years of quiet frustration condensed into a moment of shared understanding. One by one, they began to speak. Some recounted their own treatment. Others questioned where their dues had gone. Some demanded resignations, and then came the moment that shifted everything. A board member, someone long overshadowed by Karen's dominance, admitted there had not been an election in years. He acknowledged procedural shortcuts. He claimed ignorance rather than intent, but the effect was the same. Their authority unraveled in real time. The room responded not with panic, but with resolve. Residents called for a vote to dissolve the acting board until proper elections could be held. Several offered to form a temporary committee to oversee the process. The motion was seconded before Karen could object. She tried, of course. She spoke of bylaws she had not read, rules she could not cite, processes she had never followed. But the weight of her voice no longer held anyone in place. The structure she relied upon collapsed under the evidence laid before everyone. By the time the meeting ended, the board's power had been suspended. Elections were scheduled. All outstanding fines and enforcement actions, including those against him, were frozen pending review. Residents left with copies of the documents he had prepared, talking among themselves with a sense of relief they hadn't known was possible. Karen left without speaking to anyone. He walked home through a neighborhood that looked unchanged on the surface, but something fundamental had shifted. The silence that once surrounded every violation notice and threat had been broken. The fear the board relied on had dissolved. The house she had tried to take still stood exactly where it always had, unchanged in structure, but no longer under siege. She had believed she could force him out through persistence. Intimidation and authority taken for granted. Instead, he dismantled the system she used to control others by knowing it better than those who abused it. And in the end, she didn't take his home. She lost her power.